A bureaucratic civil war is brewing in the Pentagon over competing military satellite networks, and only one architecture will survive. Europe is preparing to unleash the most aggressive space regulations in history, with enforcement powers that could reshape the global industry. And $3.1 billion in space investment is reshaping the commercial sector, with defense dollars leading the charge. Welcome back to On the Radar. For those of you who are new, I'm Eric Hillsberg, product manager for aerospace at MathWorks, but the views I'm sharing on this channel are entirely my own. Recently, I've spent a lot of time covering the news surrounding NASA's funding, so in this week's episode, I'll give you an update on everything else going on in space. All sources will be linked below in the description. Let's get into it. Let's start with the institutional battle that's reshaping American military space strategy. The Space Development Agency has been implementing what seemed like a clear vision: the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, or PWSA. Instead of a few exquisite satellites, SDA is building a mesh network of hundreds of smaller, less expensive satellites in low Earth orbit. SDA is employing a methodology called spiral development, delivering new capabilities in batches called tranches every 2 years. This approach reduces risk of obsolescence by incorporating new technology into the existing architecture. Tranche 1 is the critical test. This consists of 126 transport layer satellites for data communication and 28 tracking layer satellites with infrared sensors for missile warning and tracking. These launches are happening monthly for the next year, and SDA officials are calling this their make or break moment, the first time that the architecture will provide actual warfighting capability. But with new administrations comes new priorities. The Trump administration has halted funded for Tranche 3 of the transport layer and announced Milnet, a new proliferated LEO satellite communications program that will use SpaceX's Starshield exclusively. Milnet represents a fundamentally different philosophy. Instead of SDA's self-operated multi-vendor approach, Milnet would be government-owned and contractor-operated, potentially consolidating around a single provider. The network would comprise of over 480 satellites operated by SpaceX using Starshield terminals with enhanced encryption over commercial Starlink. While Milnet could prove cheaper or have superior features to PWSA, a single vendor for such an important system should give anyone pause. And luckily, the DoD is full of smart people, so the Pentagon is now conducting an analysis of alternatives to determine the optimal path forward. They're evaluating government-owned solutions versus commercial options and exploring optical terminals from non-SpaceX vendors, specifically to avoid what they call vendor lock. The future of these programs are still murky. The Space Force has explicitly identified Milnet as a top unfunded priority requiring over $4 billion. Meanwhile, future funding of SDA's established program was halted. Only one of these architectures will likely receive full funding, and that choice will define American military space communications for decades, especially because this data will feed directly into the missile defense programs like Golden Dome. If you haven't heard, President Trump has mandated delivery of a layered homeland missile defense shield called the Golden Dome within 3 years, and General Michael Gutlin recently confirmed his program manager has been given direct reporting authority to Deputy Secretary of Defense to expedite the program. The project is certainly ambitious. Golden Dome aims to integrate existing systems like the ground-based mid-course defense, Aegis, THAAD, and Patriot with new technologies including space-based interceptors and whoever emerges as the winner between PWSA and Milnet. The initial $25 billion of approved funding could eventually grow to $175 to $500 billion total. Space-based interceptors represent the most technically challenging component. These are essentially kinetic kill vehicles that must be deployed in orbit, maintain operational readiness for years while exposed to the space environment, and then execute precision intercepts of incoming missiles traveling at hypersonic speeds. The challenges aren't necessarily new. SBIs need propulsion systems for orbital maneuvering and final intercept guidance, sophisticated sensor packages for target acquisition and determination, robust communication systems for ground command and real-time updates, hardened electronics to survive radiation and debris, and thermal management systems to operate across extreme temperature variations from Earth's shadow to direct solar exposure. Sound familiar? The intercept physics are really where the complexity lies. Calculating trajectory solutions for a maneuvering hypersonic target from orbit requires processing multiple variables: target velocity and acceleration, atmospheric effects on trajectory, orbital mechanics of the interceptor platform, and the timing precision needed for kinetic kills is measured in microseconds. General Gutlein also raises an important question. He says that technology exists. What we have not proven first, can I do it economically? And then second, can I do it at scale? The Space Force is soliciting industry ideas for quick and efficient SBI deployment, exploring novel development approaches, including prize contests and cooperative work with industry, rather than the traditional requirements-based acquisition. Similar to Milnet concerns, we also need to be sure that we don't face vendor lock in such an important aspect of our defense. The Trump administration is courting Amazon's Project Kuiper for data relaying services and engaging rocket companies like Stoke Space and Rocket Lab for launch contracts. Traditional defense giants including Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and L3Harris are also in discussions. While SpaceX still has the inside track for major portions of the Golden Dome, sources indicate its share of the program could shrink. Imagine if SpaceX were to face production issues, financial difficulties, or continued political tensions. America's most critical defense programs could be at risk. Diversification of vendors remains a common concern in procurement. While the Pentagon reshapes its space and missile defense architecture, the commercial space sector is experiencing unprecedented growth and transformation. Space startups attracted $3.1 billion in Q2 of 2025 alone, the second strongest quarter on record, with Series B and Series C funding accounting for 65% of investments. The surge isn't just about investor enthusiasm. It's being driven by concrete market opportunities, particularly the massive US defense spending increases we just discussed. Golden Dome's $175 billion initiative and other national security programs are creating viable end markets that investors can count on, and moving beyond these speculative commercial applications. The lunar economy is, of course, also a major point of interest. Intuitive Machines is preparing for their crucial IM-3 mission to Rainier Gamma in early 2026, incorporating hard-learned lessons from their previous attempts. Both Odysseus and Athena tipped over due to laser rangefinder issues. Odysseus had its systems mistakenly switched off, while Athena suffered from optical signal noise. For IM-3, they're implementing an extensive crater map library for better navigation, planning 12 lunar orbits for calibration instead of rushing to land, and they're going to use redundant laser rangefinders from separate vendors to prevent single points of failure. And they're also going to conduct comprehensive pre-flight testing on Earth to validate all of their systems. This matters because only one of 4 NASA-funded commercial lunar landers, Firefly Aerospace's Blue Ghost, has achieved complete success so far. The pressure is mounting for these companies to prove their commercial landers are viable, or NASA will be forced to stick with Firefly. Speaking of Firefly, they're planning to go public under ticker FLY and have secured significant NASA contracts, including $179 million to deliver scientific experiments to the lunar surface in 2028 and $177 million for another in 2029. This represents the maturation of the commercial lunar services market. Companies are moving from development phases to operational revenue and public market access. Perhaps most transformative are the entirely new markets emerging in orbital services. The ISS National Labs Orbital Edge Accelerator has selected 6 startups, providing up to $500,000 each to leverage ISS capabilities for research and commercialization. These companies represent the future of orbital economy. For example, Colm Morris is developing robotic systems for satellite deorbiting services, helping constellation operators comply with FCC 5-year deorbit rules while extending satellite revenue-generating lifespans. Astroscale US has signed agreements with NASA to test their refueler spacecraft for orbital refueling operations, preparing to service US DoD satellites in geostationary orbit. Refueling operations require handling hazardous propellants in zero gravity with no room for error, and we just saw the Chinese try this. The economic potential of these capabilities are enormous. If satellites can be refueled, relocated, and serviced in orbit, their operational lifespans extend dramatically. Constellation operators can optimize positioning, extend missions beyond design life, and reduce the massive cost of launching replacement satellites. The human spaceflight market is also expanding rapidly. Axiom Space completed their 4th mission to the ISS, transporting astronauts from India, Poland, and Hungary, countries that collectively paid over $65 million for the mission. This represents the first time in over 40 years that these nations have sent astronauts into orbit, highlighting growing international demand for private spaceflight access. Lockheed Martin is also exploring selling their Orion capsule flights as fixed-fee commercial services to other nations interested in space travel, potentially creating a new market for lunar tourism and international partnerships outside of the traditional government programs. However, this rapid expansion in human spaceflight is creating new challenges. The Aerospace Corporation is warning of a growing rescue gap. The acceleration in commercial crew missions isn't matched by adequate emergency response capabilities. Current spacecraft use incompatible docking systems and spacesuits, and there are no spare rockets maintained in rescue-ready status. The technical solutions exist: pre-launch data sharing, designated rescue coordinators, and tactically responsive launch capabilities demonstrated by exercises like Victus Nox. But the industry needs to implement these solutions before, not after, a crisis occurs. With statistical probability of emergencies increasing alongside mission frequency, this represents a genuine safety concern that requires immediate attention. The expansion of commercial space has also fueled ongoing debates about space traffic management in the US. The Office of Space Commerce's Traffic Coordination System for Space, or TRACS, represents America's attempt to transition space traffic management from military to civilian oversight as mandated by Space Policy Directive 3. The system is currently in beta testing, with SpaceX as a key participant, and scheduled for production release in January 2026. But the White House proposed cutting OCS funding from $65 million to $10 million, essentially eliminating TRACS. The Senate rejected these cuts, emphasizing that space traffic management is inherently governmental and should remain under civil control. Over 450 companies support TRACS funding, arguing it frees military resources for defense missions and ensures U.S. leadership in international space traffic standards. This funding battle reflects broader questions about the role of government in space traffic management. As commercial space activity accelerates, the need for coordinated traffic management becomes critical. But disagreements about funding mechanisms and institutional responsibilities could leave gaps in coverage precisely when they're needed most. With new technologies comes new responsibilities. Commercial space companies cannot focus only on the US now. Europe is preparing to implement the most aggressive space regulations in history. The EU Space Act, expected to take effect in 2030, represents a fundamental shift from voluntary industry codes to mandatory compliance with unprecedented enforcement power. The Act establishes three main pillars: safety requirements including collision avoidance, satellite deorbiting, and maintaining EU database of space objects; resilience and cybersecurity mandates covering security assessments, breach reporting, and threat intelligence sharing; and sustainability standards requiring emissions calculations, environmental data reporting, in-orbit servicing capabilities, and debris removal. But here's what makes this revolutionary: the enforcement mechanisms. The EU will have authority to impose fines up to 2% of global revenue and conduct mandatory audits, including on-site inspections. This applies to any company operating in EU markets, regardless of their home country. This contrasts sharply with the US approach, where authorities have been content to operate a set of voluntary codes of practice. American companies operating globally will now face mandatory EU requirements that may conflict with voluntary US guidelines, creating complex compliance regimes. The implication is clear. Companies need to choose not to serve EU markets or implement the most restrictive standards globally. The EU's willingness to impose steep fines and conduct international inspections gives it extraterritorial enforcement power that could reshape industry practices worldwide. Europe is also accelerating efforts for independent launch capabilities through European Launch Challenge. ESA selected 5 companies: ISAR Aerospace, Rocket Factory Augsburg, Maya Space, PLD Space, and Orbex for competition, with up to 169 million euros or 198 million US dollars in support available. This represents a fundamental shift in European space strategy. Instead of relying on established providers like Ariane rockets or foreign launch services, Europe is fostering competition among domestic companies. The goal is to ensure independent access to space while building competitive commercial capabilities. The competitive pressure is global. China's Space Pioneer has completed a launch pad for its Tianlong 3 rocket, designed for partial reusability, comparable to SpaceX's Falcon 9. Despite a previous static fire test failure, they're aiming for orbital launch and represent the growing technical sophistication of Chinese commercial space companies. Three major shifts are reshaping the space landscape. The Pentagon is weighing distributed satellite architectures against vendor consolidation, a decision that will influence military space capabilities for decades. Europe is implementing mandatory space regulations with global enforcement power, and commercial investment is flowing towards defense applications as Golden Dome and other programs create concrete market opportunities. The next 18 months will be decisive. What's your take on these developments? Do you think vendor diversification strengthens or weakens military space programs? How will Europe's regulatory power affect global industry practices? And what other indicators should we be tracking as these trends develop? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if this analysis was valuable. Thanks for watching On the Radar, and I'll see you next time.